They told me not to come home for New Year's Eve. And the way my mother said it wasn't angry or emotional, it was calm, polished, like she was declining an invitation, not rejecting her own daughter. And in that moment, I understood something I had refused to accept for years in my family. I was never really part of it. So that night, December 31st, I sat alone in my tiny apartment, staring out the window, as fireworks exploded somewhere in the distance. While across the country, my family was celebrating a house filled with light, laughter, and people who mattered. And I wasn't one of them, and the strangest part was it didn't even feel new. It felt familiar, like something I had been living my entire life without having the courage to name it, until my phone rang at exactly 12:01 a.m. And I already knew before I answered that everything was about to change because my brother never called me at that hour unless something was wrong. His voice was shaking when I picked up so badly, I almost didn't recognize him, and the first thing he said wasn't hello, it was panic. Casey, what did you do? And for a second I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I did. Because at that exact moment, my company had just gone public, valuation, 2.3 billion overnight. And I had just become one of the youngest self-made female tech billionaires in the country, but that wasn't what broke them. It wasn't the money, it was the truth. The interview, the one that went live at the same second as the IPO, the one where I released everything, emails, patent filings, recorded conversations, proving that my own brother had tried to take what I built and call it his, and I could hear chaos behind him, voices, glass, someone crying. Someone shouting my name, like I was the problem, like I had done something unforgivable. You destroyed us, he said, his voice cracking between anger and fear. Investors are calling, the board is panicking. Do you understand what you've done? And I remember leaning back, slowly staring at the ceiling, realizing something that should have hurt but didn't. Not anymore. No, I said quietly. You did that the moment you tried to take something that wasn't yours, and there was a pause, just a second of silence. But in that silence, I knew he remembered not the version of the story he had been telling everyone else, but the truth. And the truth is, this didn't start on New Year's Eve, it started 3 years earlier, back when I was still small enough to believe that family meant loyalty. I grew up in a house that looked perfect from the outside. A mansion, polished floors, quiet staff, everything controlled, everything intentional. Everything designed to look like success, but inside, it wasn't warmth, it was performance. And my brother Ethan was always the star, 5 years older, confident, charming, the kind of person who could make people trust him within minutes. Without even trying. He knew how to speak, how to move, how to make people feel important. He was everything my parents wanted, and I was everything they didn't. I preferred silence over small talk, logic over charm, code over conversations. And in my family, that made me a problem. I remember the day I got accepted into Stanford Computer Science, AI diagnostics, everything I had worked for. My parents smiled for photos, told people how proud they were. But later that night, overheard my mother telling someone it's just a phase, she'll grow out of it. And in that moment I understood something I never said out loud. My dreams were not real to them, and still I stayed still, tried, still hoped that one day they would see me. I just didn't realize they never planned to. And 3 years ago, when I was working in a tiny apartment building, something that was finally mine, I thought maybe this time things would be different. My algorithm started as an idea I couldn't let go of, a way to detect early stage disease through patterns in medical imaging that even trained doctors could miss. And every night I stayed up refining it, testing it, rebuilding it, like my entire life depended on it, because it did. And then one afternoon my mother called. Casey, we need to talk about Ethan, and I should have hung up, but I didn't. Reed Biotech is struggling, she said. Your brother is under pressure, you need to help him. Not. Can you not? Would you need? And I told her I was in the middle of something important, and she repeated that word, important, like it didn't belong to me. Startups are for people with nothing to lose, she said. You have a family legacy. And in that moment I understood exactly what she meant. What I built didn't matter, what Ethan needed did. And still I said yes because some part of me still wanted to be chosen. And a few days later, I walked in to read biotech, and for a moment I thought, maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was what being part of a family looked like. Until I sat in that room and watched my brother present my work, my ideas, my structure, like it had always been his, and when someone asked who I was, he smiled and said, "She's just helping." And that was the moment something inside me shifted quietly but permanently, because deep down, I knew this wasn't help. This was the beginning of something much worse. And I should have walked away that day. I should have protected myself, but I didn't, because I still believed something that was never true, that blood meant loyalty, and I had no idea that belief was about to cost me everything. I didn't walk away that day, and if I'm being honest with you, it wasn't because I didn't see what was happening. It was because I didn't want to believe it. I told myself I was overthinking that Ethan didn't mean it, that maybe I was just sensitive because deep down I was still trying to earn something that had never been freely given to me. And that was my first mistake, because when someone shows you who they are, you don't get to rewrite it into something easier to accept you. Either face it or you pay for it later. And I chose to pay for it later. A few days after that meeting, Ethan sent me a message asking me to come back to the office. He said he wanted to formalize things, make everything official so we could work together properly. And I remember staring at that message longer than I should have, because something about it didn't feel right. But I went anyway, because I had spent my entire life saying yes when I should have said no. His office was exactly the same as always, clean, sharp, everything in place, like nothing messy was ever allowed to exist there. And when I walked in, he didn't waste time. He slid a document across the table and said, "It's just a standard NDA, nothing complicated, just to protect the Minicrease company." And I picked it up slowly, reading line by line, and the more I read, and the colder I felt, because this wasn't just protection, this was control. The wording was broad intentionally, vague, covering anything related to Reed Biotech, past, present, and future, and for a moment I hesitated, which was something I rarely allowed myself to do in front of him. "This protects me too, right?" I asked quietly, and he smiled immediately without missing a beat. "Of course, we're family, Casey. We look out for each other." And I wanted to believe that I really did, so I signed it. And the second I did, something shifted, not around me, but inside me, like I had just handed over a piece of myself without fully understanding what it cost me. And at first nothing changed, at least not on the surface. Ethan kept calling me into meetings, asking questions, wanting input, making it seem like I was part of something bigger. Like maybe this was what I had been waiting for all along, to be included, to be acknowledged, to finally be seen. But slowly, almost invisibly, things started to move in a direction I couldn't ignore. He stopped asking for my opinion and started telling people ideas that sounded too familiar. He stopped inviting me to important meetings and started referencing work I had never approved. And then one afternoon I saw it. The pitch deck he had sent to investors. And it wasn't just similar to my work, it was my work, the structure, the language. Even the phrases I had created word for word presented like it belonged to him, and I remember staring at the screen, feeling like the ground beneath me had just disappeared, not because I didn't understand what was happening, but because I did, and I had let it happen. I drove to his office that same day, my hands shaking, not out of fear, but something closer to clarity. And when I walked in, I didn't sit down. I just looked at him and asked him directly, "What are you doing?" And for a second, he didn't answer. He just watched me like he was deciding which version of the truth to give me, and then he said calmly, "I'm saving the company, Casey," and I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the first honest thing he had said, and I asked him, "Whose work are you using?" And his expression didn't change. "Yours," he said, like it wasn't even a question. Like it was already decided, and that was the moment everything inside me went quiet, not angry, not emotional, just clear. "You don't get to take this," I said slowly. "This isn't yours." And that's when his tone shifted, not dramatically, just enough to show me what I had been refusing to see. "You signed NDA," he said. Anything related to our business belongs to Reed Biotech, and I remember feeling something cold settle in my chest again, but this time it wasn't confusion, it was realization because this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned from the beginning, and before I could respond, the door opened, and my mother walked in like she had been there all along. Waiting for the moment, Casey, she said, sitting down calmly, your brother is under pressure. This is bigger than you, bigger than your little project. And there it was. The word little reducing everything I had built into something disposable, something easy to take, something easy to erase. Just give him the algorithm, she continued, like I was asking me to pass the salt, not give up years of my life. And for a moment I looked at both of them, not as family, not as people I was supposed to trust, but as exactly what they were. People asking me to disappear so they could survive, and I said no, and the room changed instantly. The warmth was gone, replaced by something sharp, something cold, something real. You're making a mistake, Ethan said quietly, and I shook my head. No, I said. I just finally understand, and I walked out of that room without looking back. But before I reached the elevator, I stopped, pulled out my phone, and pressed record. Because something told me that from that moment on, nothing they said would be meant for me. It would be meant to protect themselves, and I was done being unprepared for that. After I walked out of that office, everything changed, and not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in something much quieter and far more painful. It was like I had been slowly erased from a life that was never fully mine. To begin with, the calls stopped first. Not all at once, just fewer each week. Then the first 20 invitations disappeared. Sunday, dinners, holidays, events that I used to attend out of obligation were suddenly no longer meant for me, and at first I told myself it was temporary, that things would settle, that someone would reach out, explain, fix something, but no one did. Instead, I saw everything through a screen, photos of my family smiling together, captions about family nights, and important moments that didn't include me, like I had never existed, like I had been edited out of my own story. And the worst part wasn't the silence. It was how easy it seemed for them to continue without me, like I had always been optional. And I remember sitting in a small cafe one afternoon, staring at my phone as another photo appeared. My parents standing beside Ethan, laughing, glasses raised, people around them, celebrating something I hadn't even been told about. And I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, not anger, not even sadness, just something emptier. Something that felt like finally seeing the truth, without trying to soften it. And that was the moment I stopped waiting for them to choose me, because they already had. And they had just never chosen me. And a few days later, I tried to call my father, not because I expected anything different, but because some part of me needed to hear it directly. I needed to stop guessing and finally know where I stood. He answered on the third ring, distracted, like I had interrupted something more important. Casey, he said quickly, what's going on? I took a breath, trying to keep my voice steady. Why am I suddenly not welcome? And there was a pause. Not long, just enough for me to realize he had already decided what to say. Your mother and Ethan are under a lot of pressure, he replied carefully. Maybe it's better if you give them space. Space, I repeated quietly. I didn't do anything. You refused to help your brother, after everything this family has given you, he said. And something inside me broke, not loudly, not dramatically, just completely. What has this family given me? I asked, my voice softer than I expected. You didn't come to my graduation. You never once asked about my work. You introduced me as someone who helps. Like I don't even belong to my own life. There was silence on the other end, and for a second I thought maybe he would finally say something real, something honest. But he didn't. Maybe you should apologize, he said quietly, and in that moment I understood everything, not just about him but about all of them. This was never about truth. It was about control, about keeping things the way they had always been, even if that meant pretending I didn't exist unless I made things easier for them. And I felt something shift inside me again, but this time it wasn't pain. It was clarity. I'm not apologizing for something I didn't do, I said. And he sighed. Like I was the one making things difficult when you're ready to be part of this family again. Let us know, he replied, and then the call ended. And I sat there staring at my phone, realizing something I had avoided my tablet. Entire life I hadn't been pushed out. I had been replaced. And for the first time, I stopped trying to earn a place that was never mine, and that same night, I went home, sat at my desk, and opened my laptop not to distract myself, but to finally face what I had been avoiding for weeks. In the evidence, emails, messages, meeting notes, everything I had saved without really thinking about why until now, and as I went through it line by line, something became clear. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a pattern. A series of choices all leading to the same place, taking what was mine, and rewriting it into something that benefited them. And I remembered what my professor once told me. If you don't protect your work, someone else will take it. And for the first time I realized, protecting my work meant doing something I had spent my entire life avoiding speaking up. And that thought scared me more than anything. Not because I doubted the truth, but because I knew what it would cost me. But then I thought about everything I had already lost, trying to stay quiet, and I understood something. I should have understood a long time ago. Silence was costing me more. And that was the moment I made a decision, not out of 20 anger, not out of revenge, but out of something much simpler. I was done disappearing. And if you've ever been in a place where staying quiet felt safer than telling the truth, I need you to stay with me, because what I did next didn't just change my life. It changed everything. I didn't make the decision that night all at once, but once it settled inside me, it didn't leave either. I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the glow of my laptop reflecting back at me like a mirror. I couldn't look away. From scrolling through every email, every message, every version of my work that I had ever shared with Ethan, and the more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, calculated, built step by step, like a plan that had always been waiting for the right moment to unfold, and for the first time, I stopped asking why and started asking what I was going to do about it, because the truth is, knowing you've been betrayed is one thing, but deciding to respond, two, it is something else entirely, and I wasn't used to choosing conflict. I had spent most of my life avoiding it, shrinking around it, convincing myself that staying quiet was strength, that letting things go was maturity. But sitting there that night, I realized something I should have realized years ago. Silence had never protected me. It had only made it easier for people to take from me, and that thought stayed with me long enough to turn into something solid, something unmovable. I opened a new document and started writing. Not a story, not an explanation, but a timeline. Every date, every meeting, every version of my algorithm, every message from Ethan, every moment. That proved this had started with me. And as I wrote, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not fear, but control. Like I was finally taking back something that had been slipping away piece by piece without me noticing. And by the time the sun started to rise, I had something I had never had before. Not just the truth, but proof, and proof changes everything. A few days later, I sat across from a lawyer in a quiet office downtown. His name was Daniel Hayes, one of the best in intellectual property law, and I remember feeling out of place, walking in, like I didn't belong in a room where people. I fought these kinds of battles for a living, but he didn't treat me that way. He listened carefully without interrupting, as I explained everything, showing him the documents, the emails, the recordings I had started making after that last meeting with Ethan, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair, studying me for a moment before he spoke. What you have here, he said, isn't just a disagreement, it's a case. And that word case landed heavier than I expected because it made everything real in a way it hadn't been before. So I asked him the only question that mattered. Can they take it? And he didn't hesitate. No, he said clearly. Not if what you're showing me is accurate. You filed your patent before any of this, before he presented anything, before the NDA even came into play. And that's when I felt it. For the first time, not relief exactly, but something close to it, like the ground beneath me wasn't as unstable as I thought. But Daniel didn't stop there being right. Doesn't mean being safe, he continued. They may still try to pressure you, manipulate you, discredit you, especially if they think you won't fight back. And I let that sit for a moment. Because he wasn't telling me anything I didn't already know, he was just saying it. Out loud, and hearing it made it harder to ignore. So what do I do? I asked. Quietly. And he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. You document everything. You protect what's yours. And when the time comes, you decide how much of the truth you're willing to make public. And that. I was the moment everything shifted again. Not because I suddenly felt stronger, but because I understood something clearly. For the first time I had a choice. I could stay quiet, protect what little connection I still had with my family, and let them continue rewriting my work into something that benefited them, or I could tell the truth, knowing exactly what it would cost me, and neither option was easy, but only one of them would let me keep myself. And I knew that even before I admitted it out loud. I left his office that day with a copy of every document secured, legally backed, protected in a way it had never been before. And as I walked out into the street, the city felt different. Not brighter, not lighter, just clearer, like I was finally backed. Seeing things without trying to soften them, and over the quoting. Next few weeks, everything moved quietly on the surface. Nothing changed. My family didn't reach out. Ethan continued as if nothing had happened. Reed Biotech kept moving forward, presenting plans, expanding, making promises. But underneath that surface, I was building something else. Not just my company, but my position. Every piece of evidence organized, every detail verified, every conversation documented. I stopped reacting and started preparing. And the more I prepared, the more I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a pattern. About what happens when people assume you'll stay quiet because you always have. And one night, sitting alone again, I opened my laptop and read through everything. One more time. The full timeline. The evidence. The truth laid out. In a way that no one could deny. And I asked myself a question I had been avoiding for weeks. Am I ready for what happens next? Because once the truth is out there, you don't get to take it back. You don't get to control how people see you. You don't get to choose who stays and who walks away. And I knew the answer before I even finished the question. I wasn't ready, but I wasn't willing to stay silent either. And sometimes that's enough. And if you've ever stood at that edge where telling the truth means losing everything you thought you had, then you understand what comes next. Because I wasn't preparing for a conversation. I was preparing for a moment, and that moment, I was coming whether I was ready or not. The email came on a Tuesday afternoon, and at first I almost ignored it because by then I had gotten used to filtering out anything that didn't feel urgent or necessary, but something about the subject line made me pause. A feature. Request interview opportunity, major publication, and I remember staring at the screen for a moment before opening it slowly, reading each word carefully, as if I expected it to disappear. If I moved too fast, they wanted to cover my company, my work, my journey leading up to the IPO, and under normal circumstances that would have been enough. That would have been everything I had worked toward: recognition and visibility, proof that what I had built mattered. But this wasn't normal anymore. Nothing about my foraying. The situation was simple, because as I sat there reading that email, realized something. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a moment, and moments like that I don't come often. The kind where you don't just get to show what you've built, but you get to decide how your story is told. And for the first time in my life, I understood that if I didn't tell it, someone else would, and they already had been for months, rewriting my work, reshaping it, minimizing it, until I barely recognized it as mine anymore, and I feel that familiar hesitation rising again, the instinct to stay quiet, to protect what little remained, to avoid turning something private into something public. Because once it's out there, it's no longer yours alone. It belongs to everyone, to opinions, to judgments, people who don't know you, but think they understand you. And I sat there for a long time, not answering, not moving, just thinking about everything that had led me to this point: the meetings, the NDA, the silence, the phone call with my NDA father, The realization that I had already lost something I couldn't get back, no matter what I chose next. And that's when it hit me clearly in a way. It hadn't before. I wasn't deciding whether to lose my family. I had already lost them. I was deciding whether to lose myself too, and that made the choice simpler, not easier, but clearer. So I replied yes, and I have something you're going to want to hear. And once I hit send, there was no going back. Everything started moving faster. After that, the interview wasn't immediate. They needed time to verify, to review. I confirm every detail. Because what I was offering wasn't just a success story. It was something much more complicated. Something that would raise questions, that would demand proof, and for weeks I worked in them quietly, providing documentation, emails, patent filings, recordings. Everything. Daniel had helped me organize everything. That turned my experience into something undeniable. And during that time, I didn't tell anyone, not my friends, not my co-founders, not even myself fully, because saying it out loud, I would have made it real in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for yet. And then 3 days before New Year's Eve, my mother called again, her voice, the same as always, controlled, precise, like nothing had changed. "Casey, about New Year's Eve," she said, skipping any greeting. "Ethan is hosting investors, partners, people from Westbridge Medical. This isn't a family gathering, it's professional," and I stayed quiet because I already knew where this was going. "I just want to be clear," she continued. "You shouldn't come." And for a second, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. "You don't want me there," I said, and there was a pause, just long enough to confirm it. "I don't want anything. That creates tension," she replied. "Ethan is under pressure. His future depends on this," and I could hear what she wasn't saying, what she never said directly, that my presence, my existence was the problem, that I was the risk that needed to all be removed. "Tell the truth," I asked quietly, and the silence that followed was louder than anything she could have said. "Don't come, Casey," she said finally, "for everyone's sake." And something inside me didn't break this time. It settled into place like a final piece of a puzzle I had been trying to avoid completing. "Don't worry," I said calmly, "I won't." And after I hung up, I stood there in my apartment looking around at the same walls, the same space, the same life that had once felt temporary. But now, I felt like the only place that had ever really been mine. And I realized something else. They weren't just excluding me, they were making room for the version of the story where I didn't exist at all, and if I let that continue, it wouldn't just erase what I had built, it would erase me entirely. And that night I opened my laptop again, not to prepare quietly, not to organize, but to finalize everything. The article, the interview, the timing, the release, every detail aligned with one specific moment, midnight, January 1st, the exact second my company would go public, and I understood exactly what I was doing. Not revenge, not anger, not destruction, but correction. Setting the record straight in a way that couldn't be ignored. And I remember sitting there looking at the final version, reading it one last time. Every line, every piece of evidence, every word that would define what happened next. And I asked myself again, "Are you ready?" And this time I didn't hesitate. No, I wasn't, but I was done waiting to be. And if you've ever reached a point where the truth feels heavier to carry than the consequences of telling it, then you understand what comes next. Because 3 days later, everything would change, not just for me but for them, and there would be no undoing it. December 31st came faster than I expected, and at the same time, slower than anything I had ever lived through. Because every hour felt like it was stretching itself thin, like time knew what was coming, and didn't want to rush it. I spent the entire day in my apartment, not because I had nowhere else to go, but because I needed the silence, I needed the stillness before everything changed. My phone stayed quiet, no calls, no messages, no last-minute attempts to include me, and that silence told me, more than anything else ever could, I wasn't forgotten. I was removed, and as the sun went down, I opened my laptop one more time, not to change anything, not to fix anything, but to make sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. Article was ready. The interview verified every piece of evidence, checked and confirmed the timeline, aligned perfectly with the IPO announcement. Everything scheduled, everything locked in place. And for a moment, I just stared at the screen, my hand resting near the keyboard, like I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't step away from anymore, and I thought about calling someone a friend. Anyone, just to hear a voice that wasn't my own. But I didn't, because this wasn't in something anyone else could carry. For me, this was mine, completely mine, and I had to see it through alone. At 11 p.m., I picked up my phone and opened Ethan's social media story, and there it was. The house glowing with lights, music spilling through the walls, guests dressed perfectly. Laughter everywhere, champagne glasses raised like everything was exactly as it should be. My mother moving through the room like she owned it. My father shaking hands with people who mattered, Ethan at the center of it all. Confident, composed, everything they had always wanted him to be. And I watched it. For longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to be there, but because I needed to remember exactly what I was walking away from. Not the house, not the money, not the image, but the illusion version of family that had never really included me. And as the countdown to midnight got closer, I closed the app, set my phone down, and turned back to my laptop. The clock in the corner of the screen, ticking forward, 11:53. 11:53, 11:56. 11:59, each second louder than the last. My heart wasn't racing, it was steady, almost too steady, like I had already crossed the point of fear, and there was nothing left but the moment itself. And then it started, the countdown, outside voices shouting 10, 9, 8. And I glanced at the screen one last time. The headline sitting there, waiting, my name, my company. The truth laid out in a way that couldn't be undone. And I thought about everything that had led me here, the years of being overlooked, the silence, the dismissal, the betrayal, and I realized something clearly. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing it because I refused to disappear. 3, 2, 1, and fireworks exploded outside, lighting up the sky as I refreshed the page, and in that exact second, everything went live. The article, the interview, the IPO announcement. My phone lit up instantly. Notifications, messages, emails, calls, all at once. Like the world had just turned its attention in my direction, and for 1 minute exactly, 1 minute, there was nothing from them. And then my phone rang. Ethan, 12:01 a.m., and I let it ring for a second, just long enough to feel the shift, just long enough to understand that everything had changed before I answered hello and his voice. I was nothing like it had ever been before, not controlled, not confident, but breaking. Casey, what did you do? And behind him I could hear it, chaos, people shouting, someone crying, glass breaking, the sound of something falling apart in real time. And I closed my eyes for a second, not to avoid it, but to take it in fully, because this was the moment the truth didn't just exist. It had consequences. I told the truth, I said calmly, and he laughed, but there was no humor in it. You destroyed us. Investors are pulling out. The board is in crisis. Do you understand what you've done? And I listened without interrupting, because for the first time I didn't feel the need to defend myself. No, I said quietly. You did that when you chose to take something that wasn't yours. And there was silence then, my mother's voice. In the background, sharp, controlled, demanding, give me the phone. And I knew this conversation wasn't over. It was just beginning. And if you've ever wondered what happens when the truth finally catches up to people who thought they could outrun it, stay with me, because what came next was something none of us could have predicted. The silence after that call didn't last long, and when it broke, it didn't come gently, it came all at once, like everything that had been held back for years, finally forcing its way to the surface. My phone didn't stop vibrating. Messages stacking on top of each other. Emails flooding in faster than I could read them. News, alerts, headlines, interviews, requests, questions from people I didn't know, all of them trying to understand what had just happened. And I sat there watching it unfold in real time, not overwhelmed, not panicked, just aware that this was no longer something contained. It had moved beyond me, beyond my apartment, beyond my control. And at 6 in the morning, I gave up trying to rest, made coffee, and opened my laptop again. The numbers were already impossible to ignore. The article was everywhere, my name trending, my company being discussed, analyzed, questioned, supported, criticized, all at the same time. And I started reading not everything, just enough to understand the pattern. Some people saw it immediately. They talked about ownership, about how often women in tech have their work taken, minimized, rewritten by people who are louder, more visible, more accepted. Others didn't see it that way. They called me selfish, said I had destroyed my own family for attention, for money, that private matters should stay private, that I should have handled it quietly. And I read those words without reacting, because I had already lived through worse opinions from strangers. Didn't carry the same weight as silence from people who were supposed to stand beside you. And then I closed everything because none of it changed what was true. A few hours later, Ethan held a press conference, and I watched it from my kitchen, standing still, my coffee untouched, as he stepped up to the podium in the same room where he had once presented my work as his own. But this time he didn't look like the same person. His posture was tight, his expression controlled but fragile, like he was holding something together that was already falling apart. I want to address the allegations made by my sister, Casey Reed. He began, and even hearing my name like that felt strange, like it belonged to someone else. My sister is going through a difficult time. We love her, we support her. But these claims are false. And the moment he said that, I knew exactly what was going to happen next, because I had already seen the evidence, I had already lived the truth. And then the questions started, fast, direct, precise. A journalist asked about the Prustos index, about timeline, the patent filings, the emails. Another asked about the recordings, about the meeting, where he demanded the algorithm, about the threats he had made. And I watched as his answers became less controlled, less confident, more defensive, as each question removed another layer of the version of reality he had built. And for a moment I felt something unexpected, not satisfaction, not relief, but recognition. Because I knew that feeling, the moment when the story you've been telling stops holding together, and you realize there's no way to fix it in real time. And then it ended abruptly. He stepped away from the podium, his voice cutting off mid-sentence, and within minutes the clip was everywhere, replayed, analyzed, broken down frame by a frame. And that was the moment the narrative shifted. It wasn't just my word anymore. It wasn't just an accusation. It was something visible, something undeniable, something people could see for themselves. And by the afternoon, Reed Biotech released a statement, formal, careful, distancing themselves from Ethan, announcing an internal investigation, emphasizing ethics, transparency, accountability. And I read it twice before setting my phone down, because I understood what it meant. They weren't defending him, they concealed an internal investigation. They were protecting the company, and that meant he was already losing control. And later that day my phone rang again. My father, and for a second I considered not answering, because I knew whatever he said wouldn't change what had already happened. But I answered anyway, because some part of me needed to hear it. Casey. His voice sounded different, older, quieter. Can we talk? And I didn't respond right away, because I wasn't sure what there was left to say. We are talking, I said finally. No, he replied. I mean really talk. And there was something in his tone that made me stay silent, just long enough for him to continue. I owe you an apology, he said, and those words should have meant something. They should have carried weight, but they didn't land the way he probably expected. Because apologies don't erase absence. They don't undo years of being overlooked. They don't rebuild something that was never fully there to begin with. I knew, he said, his voice unsteady. I knew something wasn't right with Ethan's work. I thought it was yours, and I felt something shift again, not pain, not anger, just a quiet confirmation of what I had already understood. Then why didn't you say anything, I asked. Because I thought it would work out, he said. Because I didn't want conflict, because your mother believed in him. And I let that sit for a moment, because it was the most honest thing he had ever said to me. He chose comfort over truth, image over reality, to them over me. And for the first time, he was admitting it out loud. I'm sorry, he said again, and I closed my eyes not to avoid it, but to accept it for what it was. Not enough, not too late, just real, and sometimes that's all there is. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said quietly, but I'm glad you said it, and we ended the call without trying to fix anything, without pretending it could go back to what it was. Because it couldn't. And that night, as everything continued to unfold, the headlines, the reactions, the consequences, I sat in the same place. I had been days before, but I wasn't the same person, because for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be seen. I already had been. And if you've ever wondered what it feels like when the truth finally changes, everything not just around you, but inside you, then you understand what comes next. Because this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of something I had never allowed myself before, a life that was finally mine. In the days that followed, everything slowed down in a way I didn't expect, not because things stopped happening, but because I stopped chasing them. The headlines continued, the discussions, the speculation, the opinions from people who only saw pieces of what had happened. But for me, something had shifted quietly, but permanently. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't trying to explain myself or defend my choices. I had already said what needed to be said, and the truth was doing what it was supposed to do, standing on its own, without me holding it up. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to let go, not of what I had built, but of the need to be understood by people who had never really tried to see me. And a few days later, I received a message from Ethan, not a call, not a demand. Just a short, simple text, "Can we talk?" And I stared at it longer than I expected, because a part of me still remembered who he used to be. Or maybe who I thought he was. And after everything that had happened, after the press conference, after the investigation, after the board stepped in and removed him from his position, I knew this wasn't about power anymore. It wasn't about control. It was about something much smaller and much harder to face. And I didn't answer right away, not because I was avoiding it, but because I needed to be sure I wasn't going back into the same pattern of giving more than I should. And 2 days later, I called him, and when he answered, his voice was different, stripped of what everything he used to hide behind. "Casey," he said quietly, "thank you for calling." And I didn't respond to that. I just asked, "What do you want?" And there was a pause long enough for me to hear the weight of everything he hadn't said yet. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and the words came out slower than I had ever heard from him before, like he was choosing them carefully, not for impact, but because he didn't have anything else left to stand on. I didn't realize how far I had gone. I thought I was fixing things. I thought I was protecting the company, and I listened without interrupting, because for the first time I didn't feel the need to correct him or challenge him. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He was trying to understand something I should have understood a long time ago. "You didn't just take my work," I said quietly. "You tried to erase me, and there was no defense to that. No argument, no justification, just silence." And then I heard it, something I had never heard from him before. Not confidence, not control, but regret. Real, unfiltered regret. "I know," he said, "and I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to say it." And for a moment I didn't know how I felt. Not relief, not anger. Just something still. Something quiet, like the storm had already passed, and all that was left was what it had changed. I don't know if I can forgive you," I said honestly. "But I hear you," and we ended the call there, not with closure, not with resolution, but with something more real, acceptance of what had happened without pretending it could be undone. And a week later, his public statement was released. A full admission, not partial, not careful, but clear. He acknowledged everything. The misuse of my work, the pressure, the threats, the attempt to present it as his own. He stepped down from every position at Reed Biotech. Not because he was forced, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. And when I read it, I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel like I had won anything, because this was never about winning. It was about no longer losing myself. And as the company moved forward, restructuring, rebuilding, trying to repair what had been broken, I moved forward too. Not away from the past, but through it, building my company, expanding my work, creating something that no longer needed validation from the people who had once dismissed it, and a few months later, I stood on a stage in front of a room full of people. Not investors, not media, just individuals who had their own stories, their own battles, their own moments, where they had to decide whether to stay silent or speak, and I told them the truth, not just what happened but what it cost, what it felt like to lose something you thought you needed in order to keep something you finally realized mattered more: yourself. And as I stood there, I understood something I wish I had known earlier: that your value isn't something other people get to define. It isn't something you earn by being accepted or validated or chosen. It's something you recognize in yourself, and once you do that, once you stop waiting for permission to exist fully, everything changes. Not all at once, not perfectly, but enough. And if you've stayed with me until this point, if you've listened not just to what happened, but to what it meant, then I want to leave you with this. There will be moments in your life when you are asked to choose between keeping the peace and keeping yourself, and it will never feel easy. It will never feel clean. But if keeping the peace means losing who you are, then that was never peace to begin with. It was silence, and silence has a cost. I paid it for years without realizing it, until one day I couldn't anymore. So whatever you're carrying, whatever you've been quiet about, whatever part of Cardiff yourself you've been shrinking to make others comfortable, remember this: you don't owe anyone. Your disappearance, your voice matters, your work matters, and you deserve to exist fully, without apology. And if any part of this story felt real to you, if it stayed with you even for a blank force moment, then I'd really like to hear from you. Tell me what you would have done in my place. Would you have spoken up or stayed silent, or something in between? Because there isn't one right answer. There's only the choice each of us makes when we decide who we are. And once again, thank you for being here, and for listening, for sharing this space with me. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to subscribe, leave a comment, and come back for the next one, because sometimes the stories we tell are not just about the past, they're about helping someone else find their way forward.